Hello, in this video we're going to discuss the inflation output trade-off, how we get from the short-run aggregate supply curve to the Phillips curve. You've probably seen that there's two ways to discuss the short-run relationship between output and changes in the price level, what we call inflation. The short-run aggregate supply of goods and services, this is red upward sloping line that tells us that as sellers see their market prices rise, they're going to produce more goods and services, at least in the short run. On the horizontal axis, we have aggregate supply and aggregate demand. On the vertical axis, we have the price level. Over here in the Phillips curve, this is a green upward sloping line that tells us that there's a positive relationship between inflation, the rate of growth of price levels, and the output gap, at least in the short run. Now we might mention that the original version of the Phillips curve showed a relationship between inflation and unemployment, and that was a negative one. But in more modern versions of the Phillips curve, we have the output gap on the horizontal axis and the inflation rate in percent on the vertical axis. Actually, these two analytical tools are closely related. In this video, we're going to see how we get from one to the other. Let's start with the short-run aggregate supply curve. We've expressed it both graphically and as an equation. So let's take a look at this equation. Potential output is represented by this vertical black line. It's sometimes called full employment output, and it reflects the long-run capacity of the economy to produce goods and services. Now the slope of this line is reflected in what we call the elasticity of short-run aggregate supply with respect to prices. And this is related to the slope of this line, so we're multiplying this by price growth minus expected price growth. So really, this elasticity tells us how much more sellers will supply when their output price rises relative to their expectations of the overall price level. We also should note that this is sometimes called a Lucas supply function, after Nobel laureate Robert Lucas. Now, to see the role of prices in this equation, let's first consider an outward shift in aggregate demand that reflects an increase in the money supply. We're assuming here that the money supply has risen on a once and for all basis. In the long run, the classical neutrality proposition holds. If the money supply rises by 5% and nothing else changes, prices will rise by 5%, but with no long-run effect on output. So what we're going to see is that initially both prices and output will rise. Extra demand is immediately reflected in higher costs for firms as they ramp up output. To some extent, then, purchasers will see higher prices. So the bottom line here is that we're going to see higher output and higher prices in the short run. But firms have not yet fully absorbed the fact that the money supply has permanently risen. So initially, the expectations of the future price level are fixed. Gradually, markets are going to recognize that the overall price level will move up with the money supply on a one-to-one basis. So the short-run aggregate supply curve here has shifted upward from the solid red line to the dotted red line. There's two reasons why this may happen. We talk about misperceptions and we talk about long-term contracts. We discuss these topics at greater length elsewhere. As we move along the demand curve, demand gets squeezed, prices rise, output is moving back towards its long-run level. Over time, we're going to see even more adjustment, reflected in even further leftward shifts of the short-run aggregate supply curve. More firms are learning that the shock to demand was an aggregate one, not just for their sector, and more firms are updating their contracts to reflect the new long-run aggregate price level that was implied by the money supply increase. As this happens, we continue to move leftward along the aggregate demand curve, higher prices squeezing out aggregate demand. So finally, in the long run, prices are going to fully reflect the money supply increase, and output is going to return to its original potential level. Prices have now risen one-to-one with the money supply. So you can see over here we're back to the long run, and that these two terms here have now canceled out. The short-run aggregate supply curve can also reflect changes in the production process of goods and services, what we like to call production-based shocks. Here, some sort of event has caused the short-run aggregate supply curve to shift upward and to the left. Prices rise and demand is squeezed out. We call this an adverse or a bad shock, and examples would include bad harvests, an earthquake, a storm, a drought, some other natural disaster, a strike or a power outage, or also an increase in imported oil prices. We can also have a favorable or a good shock. Here, in this case, we see the short-run aggregate supply curve shift downwards. Prices fall, demand is encouraged, output rises. We have examples: better than average harvests or weather, or a decrease in imported oil prices. So now how are we going to get to the Phillips curve? Let's start out by rewriting the short-run aggregate supply curve. Now our first step is we're going to divide both sides by potential output. So you see we're getting rid of that here. Our second step is we're going to subtract 1 from both sides. That means we're going to get the output gap on the left-hand side. Now our third step is just to simplify our inflation terms. So the current price level over the initial price level is equal to inflation. The expected prices over the current price level minus 1 is expected inflation. We're going to plug those guys back in there, and we're going to get a very simplified short-run aggregate supply or Lucas supply function. And the final step is just to flip this, and we solve out for inflation, and that's how we're going to get this output gap inflation upward sloping green line. So we have a spreadsheet based exercise to help you solidify these concepts. We can think of either the short-run aggregate supply function or what we call the Lucas supply function, and here we give some assumptions in terms of the elasticity, inflation, expected inflation, the level of production-based shocks, and we solve out for the gap. Or alternative, we can use the Phillips curve version of this, and we give some assumptions for the elasticity again, expected inflations, gap, and the production-based shock, and we'll get inflation. So our key takeaway here is that we've seen that there's two ways to discuss the short-run relationship between output and inflation, but these two ways really have underlying assumptions that are equivalent. So that's it for now.